And I love this title, is the government coming for your radio? And as you know, very recently, the FCC made an announcement about certain products that are banned for import and use in this country. And that got a whole bunch of folks stirred up in the amateur service, wondering about Chinese radios like their Baofengs and their Wushan radios and all of that. And so we thought it would be a good idea to kind of clear the air on that and talk about exactly what they did, what as it says here, what did the regulators really do? And what kind of stuff have they done in the past? We wanted to cite a few things from the past to give you an example of when they actually have done that. Banned certain products in the amateur service. Some of you may remember some of these things. But once in a while, things do happen. They do change the regulations. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So there we go. So next chart. Come on. Where are you? Wrong window. There we go. So there is a lot of rumor about this. You know, that you've seen it. I know we've seen this on various forums where they're talking about not being able to use these radios. Well, what actually happened recently is the FCC, since about 2018, has maintained this thing they called a covered list. And the covered list pertains to products that pose a threat to national security. And this latest foray has to do with foreign-owned manufacturers of telecom equipment. Well, radios fall into that category, but telecom, thinking more about network type equipment, network hardware, network software. And there's a lot of video hardware, video surveillance equipment that falls into that category. And there's one other interesting one that falls in this category. But the question becomes, does this latest thing apply to a ham radio? And the answer to that is most probably not. It wouldn't apply to amateur radio. However, it could apply to certain groups like public safety, you know, police departments, government agencies, what have you, that might be using radios that use encryption systems that might fall under some of these covered items, some of that software. So that's why we say, should I be concerned as a ham? Not really. We shouldn't be concerned about this because, first of all, we're not using radios that provide encryption. We shouldn't be anyway. And we shouldn't be doing anything that is involved with threats to national security. Certainly amateur radio shouldn't be a threat to national security by any stretch. But we'll talk a little bit more about all this.
One of the manufacturers that's come up in the news over the past few years is Huawei in terms of telecom equipment. So you can see multiple examples of that restrictions on Huawei telecom equipment.
So this is nothing new. And back in 2018, there was a big furor about the UV5R from Baofeng. It may say hams thinking, well, did the FCC make it illegal? Well, no, they didn't. At least not for the amateur service. It is certified for use in the amateur service. All right. What they were looking at was use of the UV5R in other services, like GMRS, other parts of it's CFR 47, which is what covers the Federal Communications Commission and all of our stuff, which falls under Part 97, as you know. But there are other parts, Part 90, which is public mobile radio service, which GMRS, things like that are covered under Part 90. The UV5R was not certified for those services. However, they would work in that service. So transmitters were open, so they could operate there. So what comes out of this is radios cannot be used outside of the service for which they are certified. This is the point that the FCC tried to make back there. So if you have a radio that's certified for Part 97, but not certified for Part 90, you can't use it in Part 90. Okay, so that's the important thing. So then the next question is, well, if it's illegal to use it in that, is it legal to even import them, to market them, to buy or sell in the US? Well, what came out of this is one of the manufacturers I should say manufacturers, it was an importer, was actually cited by the FCC for selling UV5Rs that were open outside of Part 97. They were certified for Part 97, but they were open on Part 90, and they were marketing these things as Part 90 radios. That got shut down by the FCC. You might have seen that in the news back in, especially in, if you follow ARRL and things like that, their news services that did show up back in 2018, where the marketing company was shut down from selling these things because they did GMRS and they were advertising them as such. Okay. So those radios were only certified at that time to operate in the ham band. So that's an important note. And this applies to a lot of radios that we use today. In fact, virtually everything that you purchase that's commercially manufactured for amateur use goes through a certification process and is certificated to operate under Part 97. The exceptions to that are radios that were manufactured prior to a certain date, and it depends on the type of radio as to what date it is, and things like homebrew equipment. Stuff you build yourself, it really doesn't apply. What you're required to do is to make sure, if you build your own equipment, it has to operate within the standards that are set up in Part 97 of for the amateur service. So that's things like spurious emissions and stuff like that. That's what's important for homebrew equipment. The stuff operating under Part 90 you can only operate in Part 90 with radios that are certified for Part 90. You can't operate a Part 97 radio in Part 90. So that's the whole point. You can't operate GMRS with an amateur license. It turns out you can't modify, the one that I love is you can't modify certain Part 97 equipment unless you have an amateur license. So in other words, if you have a radio that's certified under Part 97, let's say a Baofeng UV5R, unless you have an amateur license, you can't even modify that radio. You're not allowed to do that. It's regulated. That says you can't do that. So that's another interesting aspect of it. So radios in Part 90 have to have a Part 90 license, just like we have to have a Part 97 license. GMRS, etc., have to have a Part 90 license and have a radio that's certified under Part 90. So here we go. This latest thing, this is what we were talking about earlier with the certain items on the covered products list that are Chinese, not ham radios. This doesn't apply to the Wushan and Baofeng radios. They're not part of this ban. As Michelle said, it's this certain manufacturers of certain products that are not amateur radio products, but are things like telecom. I mentioned routers, switches, that type of thing, Ethernet type hardware, Wi-Fi hardware. They considered some of these to pose a threat to national security. So therefore, they've been banned under certain agencies and organizations. Amateur radio isn't one of those, but if you happen to be a government agency, yep, you can't use this stuff. If you're in public safety, police, fire, etc., you can't use these products. If you're a critical infrastructure, if you're I suppose if you're a power plant, or you're a telecom provider, or let's say a telecom provider, yeah, let's talk about that. Let's talk about maybe a refinery or something like that. Nope, can't use this stuff. But not an amateur radio. So they're not going to come and take your UV5R because it was made in China. So the list of companies, these are the primary ones. So we talked about the Chinese owned companies, and one of them is right here in California, which I wasn't aware of, is this Pacific Networks. It was a wireless service right up the coast here from where we are in Santa Barbara. Was a wireless telecom provider. They're banned. They've been shut down. Their subscribers have had to go to other companies. The one that's interesting is Kaspersky. If you're familiar with Kaspersky's been around forever, and some of the best antivirus software there is. Problem is, it's Russian-owned. So, if you think about it, this software is scanning all of our computers It's looking for malicious code. It's looking for malware. That's what they're looking for. But who knows? Maybe they're looking for other stuff. Since it's a Russian company, I think these guys are a little nervous about that. So in other words, nowadays, as of this latest list, government agencies can't use Kaspersky antivirus software. You're welcome to use it at home. But if you're a government agency or critical infrastructure or public safety type thing, you can't use Kaspersky. But it's a shame because, you know, the key here is that antivirus software will scan for malicious code. And when it finds things, it does talk to the mothership. It does send information back to the manufacturer. All of them do that. So that's what you need to be aware of. So who knows what it's scanning and retrieving. But as you see, a lot of these companies are video surveillance and telecom equipment manufacturers or providers of that type of equipment. And I think that the one you were mentioning, Michelle, is that the one at the bottom, the Hawaii?
Yeah, that's Huawei.
That's the one you were talking about, is Huawei. Yeah, that's
it's telecommunications equipment. And another interesting point about Kaspersky Labs or Kaspersky is the concern is twofold. I think you explained it very well, that you have something that you allow to really thoroughly scan your computer, and that's a little scary. But the other thing is, if the antivirus has a list of things that it whitelists or that it passes, that it decides to allow, that there's flags that the malware would have, that we're going to let these long-term sort of sleeper cells stay on your computer and very slowly exfiltrate information. And on a government computer, this is pretty disastrous. So it's two different things. It's can insert stuff. The concern was it can introduce things into infrastructure, or that it will allow long-term persistent threats to remain. But they're kind of in cahoots, and that's a similar concern with some of these other companies in the telecom, that there will be things that will allow the exfiltration of data over long term, and therefore the United States government has decided that it just cannot have this equipment, can't take the risk.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. Yeah, that's right on. So unless one of these things applies to things like Baofeng's and Wushan radios, which I don't think they do, I think we're in good shape with amateur radio.
Well, both Hytera and Tytera sell DMR radios that are used by amateurs.
I guess they are used by amateurs, but do they pose a threat to national security? And that's really the key, is they probably don't, but they may get banned, just from import anyway. They certainly can't be used by government agencies and the users we cited. They don't want them using those. They are banned. But for amateur service, I don't think they'll get banned. But eventually they may prevent them from even being imported, the DMR radios that we have access to. So I don't know. Remains to be seen. Yeah. Okay, so I want to put this next chart up, and this is the one that really, I know a lot of folks maybe are familiar with this stuff, but I wanted to say that what is actually covered under Title 47 of Code of Federal Regulations. And these are all the different parts. You hear all this stuff, but not everybody knows what all these things are. Oh, hey, we've got stereo Michelles. At least that's what I'm seeing. Oh my gosh, this is crazy. Hey, I'm back. Hey, good. So these are all the different parts that are covered under Title 47. And when Title 47 actually covers the Federal Communications Commission. And these are the different radio services. And there are other radio services. These are primarily the radio services that we talk about. And you can see the ones that really we've been talking about today or tonight are Part 90, which is the private land mobile radio services. And of course, you're all familiar with Part 96, which is the, it really covers citizens band, things like that. Part 97, which is the amateur radio service. So these services require certification by the Federal Communications Commission. They go through some pretty rigorous testing, and they have to meet certain requirements that are set forth in Title 47 as to power output, spurious emissions, the ability for that radio to be modified. In other words, if a radio can be easily modified, it may not be able to be certified. Okay. And of course, frequency range, it has to be, it's certified as to its frequency range. So these are the things that they look at. And I'm going to, I will make a comment about spurious emissions eventually, but this is Dennis's opinion based on actual measurements that we've made using laboratory grade equipment. And I actually wonder about the FCC's sanity in certificating certain radios. But anyway, that's another point. But let me give you an example of those of you who've been around for a while, you know, some of the old timers, if you're licensed back in the 70s, you may remember this little incident that occurred. Is that this is from the late 70s. And this has to do with amateur products for use in the amateur radio service going through a certification process. And this is back in April of 1978, external linear amplifiers. An external linear amplifier manufactured after April 28, 1978, that was to be used in the amateur service could not operate above 24 megahertz. It had to be blocked. So many like Heathkit, who made several amplifiers, they didn't include 10 meters or 12 meters for that matter. When it became part of the work bands, they weren't allowed to operate. They didn't include the parts for that. You could order the parts, but you had to demonstrate that you had an amateur license to be able to do that, to be able to add those parts in there. Amplifiers, commercial amplifiers, did not include, some of them never even included the provisions to be able to add those frequencies. So you never saw 28, 10 meters or 28 megahertz on the amplifier. And that was because of Part 96, that their intent was to prevent the use of these products on the citizens band, citizens radio service. Which of course in those days was limited to like 5 watts. And I think eventually they picked up single sideband in a 20 watt or 25 watt limit, but they were not allowed, they were not supposed to be using these amplifiers, which could easily be put on 11 meters, right? 27 megahertz. So in my, like I say there, in W60Q's opinion, this was a terrible inconvenience to us amateurs that wanted to operate legally. And I'm saddled right now with an amplifier here that I really love. It's a great amplifier, but it was manufactured to this certification, and it's a software controlled amplifier. It requires a software modification to operate on 10 meters and 12 meters. And of course, the manufacturer doesn't support it anymore, and we don't know what's happened to the manufacturer. They still claim to be around, but they don't do much. And that happens to be Alpha. If you're familiar with Alpha products, that this is Alpha 87A. So they have a special code that you enter that's based on the serial number of the product. How do you get that? So I can't operate this thing on 12 and 10. Not that I need to. It would help sometimes, but anyway.
This is a really good example.
Yeah.
And I was really happy to see it in here when we were working on this presentation. Was there also a rule about how many per year you were allowed to make?
As an amateur, you could only make like 5 radios in a year for your personal use. You couldn't make any more than that. So
that was an unusual rule.
Yeah, that's right. I forgot about it. Thank you.
Yeah, now would be a pretty good time to because this kind of brings it out, about why we have the FCC and what it's really all about. And there's a set of regulations and the sort of the body of work that we currently call the FCC and the regulatory law for communications was developed over time. There was a big act in 1912, the Radio Act. There was another big batch of Radio Act in 1927 to sort of kind of correct what was missed by 1912. Reason that we had the Radio Act of 1912 was to correct kind of a free-for-all on the bands. And then the FCC that we know and love really kind of came about in 1934 Communications Act. And all three of these sets of big steps forward in terms of regulatory law, the primary reason for having it is to prevent interference. And so when we look at the sort of the banning of radios and the restrictions of owning and operating and only being able to make so many and things like that, that it comes from a point of view of preventing or solving interference problems. So that's kind of, keep that in the back of your mind when we talk about this in the rest of the presentation.
Yeah, that's a good point. Very good point. And of course, as you know, the regulations are always being modified and updated as technology changes. We have to update them. But yeah, this is the actual citation. This is CFR 47, Code of Federal Regulations, Title 47, Part 97, paragraph 315 is the certification of external RF power amplifiers. There are other parts of Title 47 that apply to the amateur service, but we usually don't pay attention to those. They are there. You can actually find them and read them. And it talks about certification of amateur products within Title 47, but not within the one that we're familiar with and we need to be familiar with, being Part 97. So I've got some citations of that as well that you can actually, if you're interested in going and reading some of that stuff. It's pretty deep and there's literally thousands and thousands of pages of this stuff. So anyway, one of the interesting things is they seem to waffle back and forth, and this has come out recently in some emails that were passed around between amateurs and representatives of the Federal Communications Commission. And this kind of, I call it a conundrum. It really bugs me because on one hand, they say this, but on the other hand, they say exactly the opposite. And it's both coming from the same organization, the Federal Communications Commission. So the question was, can a radio be used under Part 97 that is certified for use in another service? And the truth to that is it's always been understood that we can do this. As amateurs, we are allowed to do that because that's part of our basis and purpose, is to experiment and explore new technologies and what have you. That's what we do. So therefore, we're going to take products from other services and modify them for use on amateur service. That's our basis and purpose. So amateurs may modify radios for use in the amateur service only, which makes sense. I mean, that's what we do. We will take a radio from a CB radio from Part 96 and modify it to use it in 10 meters. Sure, that's done all the time. We modify the old mobile Motorola FM radios, the taxi radios and old police radios. We modify those all the time for VHF, 2 meters and 440 and what have you. But what's interesting is that an email came out of this discussion that stated a radio certificated in one service cannot be used within a service it has not been certificated for. And so that's actually in denial of Part 97. It's counter to that notion that we can modify, as amateurs, licensed amateurs, we can modify radios from another service for use in the amateur service. So that one just threw me for a loop. And I know that really threw a bunch of people for a loop when they saw that statement. I think the underlying argument is that we as amateurs, licensed amateurs, and that's the key. We are licensed amateurs. We can modify other radios to operate under Part 97 if they follow the technical standards of Part 97 as to power, frequency range, spurious emissions, modes of operation, these types of things, these modulation types. Those are the keys to this, that if we do that, then we're well within our rights under Part 97 to do this. So this comment really applies to using things that are not Part 97. In other words, taking something that's not a Part 90 radio and operating it under Part 90. That's what that statement's actually focusing on, not 97. So if you're interested in some of the process, and this is quite an involved, I went through, I was reading this. This is Title 47, Chapter 1, Subchapter A, Part 2, Subpart J. And it's paragraph 1043 talks about changes in certificated equipment. And it talks about the process that you have to go through to certify a radio or be able to make a change to a certification of radio. So if I got a radio that's certified in Part 90 and I want to make changes to it, what do I have to do that? And that's really what this is all talking about, that I have to do that stuff. 97307 is really the one that we adhere to. That's the emission standards within Part 97. That's what regulates our power, frequency ranges, modes of operation, spurious emissions. And one of the things that's interesting is, and I will cite this, this is from, this is not anecdotal information. This really, I've got this, the measurements that we made using laboratory equipment with a UV5R, looking at spurious emissions from a UV5R when they first became available. And what was interesting to me is that radio was certified for use in Part 97, but we're operating it on 2 meters. And what we see, whoops, hello, one of my alarms going off, sorry. Scare me. Operating this thing under Part 97 on 2 meters, spurious emissions, the second harmonic on 2 meters was nearly as strong as the fundamental within a few dB. And so the question that came up in my mind is, how did the FCC certify that? That was certified by the FCC, but interesting. Because that doesn't comply with certain emission standards that talk about spurious emissions being at a certain level below, a certain level down from the from your fundamental transmission. And I think prior to a certain date, it's 43 dB. Nowadays, it's like 60 dB at that frequency, and it can't be more than 10 microwatts. It's nowadays, if it's below 5, if you primary fundamental transmission is 5 watts, it has to be below 10 microwatts to be compliant. So I always wondered about that. And it wasn't just one radio. There was a number of them we tested, and they all came up with a very similar result. So it was interesting. But it's certified, or I should say in their terminology, it's certificated. It's not certified, it's certificated. So that's an interesting aspect of it. But yeah, 307 is something you need to be familiar with, especially if you like building homebrew or modifying or anything. 307 is the 97307 is what you have to be familiar with in those standards. Okay, next. Here you go. That's yours, Michelle.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, this is an example from the past. So the government doesn't prevent the ownership or operation of existing radio equipment, but there's been some exceptions here, and one of them is from 1993. On the left is a Motorola, a bag phone, a very popular model from late 1991. And over on the right is a representative of the scanners that were available at the time, a Bearcat scanner. And the cellular industry in 1993 pushed really hard for a law to protect cellular phone calls. At the time, most were analog, and they were transmitted in the clear. And the cellular phone industry would really like people that buy expensive cellular phone service to feel like their phone calls are private. So it became illegal to modify radio scanners and police scanners, pretty much any scanners like the one that you see over on the right. So you could not use them or modify them to eavesdrop on cellular calls. Yeah. And so scanner makers were required to design their devices so that they would be difficult to tamper with. You had to notch out these frequencies or not have the circuits in them to that would allow you to tune into the cellular bands. Now, this law did not make it illegal to own these older scanners, but it did become federal law, against federal law, to intercept the phone conversation, which is over the air, and it definitely was illegal to pass the contents on to another party. So this is a case where you are told that you cannot receive, and you definitely cannot modify, things that you own. So that's the example from the past. This is the sort of thing that the FCC and our government are capable of doing.
Yeah, the other one that comes to mind from this, and I was trying to remember, I think it's the ICOM IC 9000 and its predecessor, and I can't remember what that was called, but that was a high-end receiver that covered like VLF 100 kilohertz all the way up to microwave, like 2-3 gigahertz. And there were two versions of that radio. There was an import version that you could buy in the United States, and there was another version that you couldn't import to the United States. One that was importable had those frequencies. They were more than just notched out. It would not operate on those frequencies. Their synthesizer probably had some custom code in it that prevented it from operating in cellular bands.
Yeah, that was very common to have it to where it absolutely would not operate. With a radio of this vintage, like the mid 1990s, a number of the Bearcat scanners was a very simple change. So the change that the manufacturer did was essentially like a diode. You could remove a diode, or it'd be a cut or jump or something like that. And there was a window there where it was a very simple change to restore these frequencies. Yeah. And now we fast forward to today, and these sorts of the radios that are becoming more and more common and of more and more interest to amateurs are software defined radios. And it's wide open. You define in software what you're going to receive and transmit, and in many cases there is no limits between the upper and lower frequency ranges that the radios are capable of. Yeah. So this is of growing interest at the FCC, and there's been a number of discussions about how to get back to the point where we can prevent people from receiving things like cell phone conversations, or how do you control something that is so flexible, that's so it's something you have complete control over, and that you can completely define your receiver and your transmitter. So we're in a different world now than the one that's represented on this slide, but with some of the same motivations: national security, or to protect a cellular industry, those sorts of large economic and security concerns, or law enforcement concerns. The movement to trunked systems, to digital trunked systems, and things like PCOM, which is a pretty simple spectral inversion to make it more difficult to monitor police transmissions. All of these things are an attempt to kind of enforce some privacy, some control over what people can listen to and tune into. And with digital transmissions, they pretty much sound like noise. So it is very difficult to listen in. You have to put in a lot more work and circuitry into your radios. So the difference between what was going on in this picture and what's going on now technically might be very different, but some of the motivations and some of the frameworks, and the who the players are is largely the same. It's control over what you can do on the air.
Yeah, that's right. I think a lot of systems, one of the ways that they're really in terms of public safety systems and government systems is going to encryption. For radios, the police departments are going to encrypted systems. Their trunk radios are becoming encrypted, and then of course they do have radios that are they will have channels available that are not encrypted, so you have communications between services. You've got to have that bridge, but within their organization, they may have specific keys for their encryption that other agencies won't have. So that's always interesting. We're going through that right now here in Kern County with our public safety systems here. They're going to encrypted systems, but it means that they won't have common keys, but they'll have channels where they can communicate back and forth between those different agencies. So it's interesting how they fight that.
Yeah, probably the biggest point that we can make is that you can see consistently over time that the government doesn't come and get your radio.
Right.
No Bearcat scanners were confiscated. You
Mhm.
could keep the old one. They established you can't listen, and you definitely cannot pass along, information that you overhear. Can't eavesdrop. The only people, as I think it's mentioned in chat and is very correct, the only people that can listen in on cellular phone conversations are law enforcement.
Law enforcement.
And law enforcement can come and listen to any of your telecom. Pretty much any telecom provider has already been contacted and already has arrangements for law enforcement, and they will give everything from the metadata to all sorts of records, and that's the way that it is.
That
But
does
no,
require,
no one's going to come and get your radio, so you get to keep the radio, even if they decided that all Titeras were gone tomorrow. It would only be from this day forward. You will not be able to buy them, and that's going to be the case. Moving forward, it's been the case in the past. That's the way that the regulators work.
Michelle, law enforcement's required warrants in the past for doing that type of interception. That's still the case, isn't it? Wouldn't they require a warrant to be able to intercept cellular transmissions or wireline transmissions?
That's a really good question. It gets complicated.
Yeah.
It does. It gets complicated. In general, yes.
Yeah, I would think in general. Yeah. Okay, I think that's our last slide here, I believe. Now I'm back to normal.
Don't make promises that you can't keep now.
Whatever normal is for me.
Looks like some good questions here. And then Paul says, doesn't the radio cease to be Never got the certificated in my mind. There we go.
Yeah.
Doesn't the radio cease to be certificated under the other part as soon as it has been modified by an amateur?
That's right.
So when we use a modified commercial radio, we aren't using a radio that's certificated in that other service. And yeah, that's my understanding as well.
That is right. Yeah.
And then only law can listen in on a cell call at this time. That's true. And then there's are they going P25? And I'm not sure.
Yeah,
what does that mean? Are they going to P25 or away? Our guys here are going to
P25. I think they already are P25, but they're upgrading all their radio systems.
Yeah, it's very common standard that's used. There's P20. There's a version 1 and a version 2, and innovations and features that get it. But yeah, it's very common to find a P25 in law enforcement and
interesting.
Public safety.
I didn't realize ZTE makes the RFinder radios.
It's a complicated landscape out there. And then Barry says, with open source software, anything is possible. Yes, right. This is true. The comment about the RF finder is they're rebranded Runebos. That's interesting.
So one of the interesting things about RFinder is those function as a cellular telephone, as well as operating under different parts, like part 90, part 95, part 97. So that's going to be an interesting one. I hadn't focused on RFinder. That could become a problem. I know that's a pretty popular radio with not just for amateurs, but within public safety groups, because they run under, it's a software defined radio, so it'll run under multiple services. That could be a problem.
Okay, we got a couple of hands up here.
Yeah.
Larry came up first. You wanted to go ahead, Larry?
Yeah. As far as the government going into the cell phones, actually monitor the cell phone, they do have to have a warrant. Yeah, but you can, in case of indigent circumstances, i.e. a missing person, or you're trying to, basically locate a missing person or trying to make an emergency contact, i.e. you have a critical situation where then they can ping but they cannot monitor. That is the current state of California guidelines they have right now for law enforcement.
Cool. Thanks, Larry. That's good information. Yeah. And Monty, you just turned your hand down. How come?
You're muted, Ryan.
No, he's muted someplace. There's no audio.
Hi, you got me now?
Yep. We got you now.
I put it down because I figured you were going to call on me next.
We hear you now.
All right. Yeah, we had to deal with this, you know, what part a radio is certificated for back when I was on the ARL board. And a lot of, you know, the same issues were raised, the concerns that, you know, you get a radio that says it's certificated for all these parts, and it can't be certificated for more than one. But it's fairly common these days and has been for a while, that if you have a ham who is a public safety officer, their radios often can be programmed to include amateur frequencies, but it doesn't really require a modification of the radio. They're broad enough. And therefore, as far as I'm aware, there's no prohibition against that. Do you know anything different?
You know, if you look at things like particular radios, if you look at the certification of, or the certification of the UV5R, which I did, I went and looked up the specs on their certification for that radio. It talks about covering 400 to, I think it's either 470 or 490 megahertz. So to me, that covers quite a few services, not just the amateur service.
Yeah.
So there's got to be another underlying regulation somewhere that limits it to where they can operate that radio. But yeah, it would be, I mean, think about how easy it is to operate an old, let's say some of the old police radios on 2 meters.
Well, you can set your XT5000, you know, to if it's a UHF, you can set it to operate in the 70 centimeter band as well. And here I'm talking about equipment that, you know, the Motorola and the Harris and all that stuff, they can program it to go down into the amateur, like the 70 centimeter band, for example. And that doesn't really involve a modification.
That's right.
It's a physical modification of the radio. So as far as I know, the law enforcement hams who do that, or the fire department hams who do that, are entitled to do it without a problem.
Absolutely entitled, because if they have a license, amateur license, they're entitled to do that. Absolutely. Makes total sense. And the comment in the chat about radios being modified by, you know, when you cut the diode, and there's a lot of radios, not just our handheld radios, but a lot of the HF multi-mode, multi-band radios out of Japan, the Yaesus and the ICOMs and Kenwoods, you cut a jumper and you've got it, the radio's wide open.
There's a wide banding procedure, right? Now, if you have a service like Shares, for example, that's not under the FCC rules, it's under NTIA.
That's right.
And they allow there's no certification requirement for any radio used on Shares. They allow and encourage using modified amateur gear to transmit on the Shares frequencies. So there's a case where the regulations explicitly allow it.
Yes. But like you say, it's not under FCC, that's NTIA's.
Right.
Under NTIA's purview. That's right.
Okay, how we doing in chat?
Oh, pretty good. There was I think that Dennis, this might have been the comment or question that you already addressed about the examples, about FT1DR. Yeah, the story behind the UV5R is interesting, because as you've explained, when it came over, it could do a lot more than just was not really restricted, right? And they got a letter, so they got a sternly worded letter, and probably with a little bit, if you don't fix it, then you're going to have to fix it. And so that's why we have a different version of this radio with the plus. You know, so it's just speculation, but if they had simply ignored it, then there might have been maybe it might have moved a little bit closer to a fine or something like that. But at no point did it ever get to a threats of being banned or people having to give them up. But yeah, it's a good question about the diode, because that coming from a hardware perspective, where you had fixed radios with fixed frequencies and fixed bands and sometimes fixed modulation, that you would have to modify the radio. And so a lot of the regulations that we're talking about were written in that context.
That's right.
And with software defined radios, it is a completely different experience. You know, and as we found in experimenting with them, a lot of software defined radios, you have to first of all, you have to program it and do a lot of the work to define your transmission, your reception. And then you have to carefully look at what you're actually putting out on the air, because a lot of the inexpensive and very commonly found software defined radios in the amateur experimenter scene are pretty messy on the air. And you absolutely, and then they do not come with a lot of power. Software defined radios generally are very low power. There are no filters built in because they have no idea what filter you could possibly want, and you're going to have to add it. So after the fact, after you've done all this work to program it, then you have to provide some amplification if you would like to be heard more than across a lab. And you have to filter it, because a lot of them are, you will be surprised at how messy it can look.
They can be very messy.
Yeah, if you're used to commercial radios that have excellent filters, or you are used to being the sort of person that knows how to design these things, then getting a fancy, innovative, cutting edge software defined radio, downloading some code from GitHub and going out and playing radio, it's a little shocking to look at it on a spectrum analyzer. So those sorts of things you're responsible for it, you know, as you laid out so well, you know, that you have to really look at the emissions and what you're producing.
That's right. Marty, you see that, you see the comment, that last comment from
Yes,
Mike?
I did. Yes, I did. And I believe you're correct that you can only, a radio can only be certificated for one particular service at a time, even though it may be capable of several. And if you modify it at all to operate in one service, you can't go back and operate it on the other one. But, you know, again, I mean, for example, you can't take a, you know, a Motorola CDM UHF radio that's a Part 90 radio, and even though it's very easy to put it on the FRS or GMRS frequencies, you can't use it for FRS GMRS frequencies, because Part 95 subsection that deals with those says you may only use radios that are certified for those, certificated for those particular services. And part of the routine for having those certificated is that you cannot modify them. I mean, for example, an FRS radio, you're not even allowed to have a detachable antenna, because they want to keep the power, the coverage down. You can't put on amplifiers and beams and things like that. Just add a real quick one back. Dennis, you mentioned earlier about some of the horrible spectrum output of some of these early import radios, the inexpensive ones. The ARRL, when they would do national conventions, they would bring some of their specialists to come along with a big spectrum analyzer and some attenuators, and they would have people testing their radios. And they found that after testing hundreds and hundreds of radios of different varieties at each of these conventions, they found that, for example, the Baofangs, to put a specific one on it, they found that some of them had harmonics that were stronger than the fundamental, and were very, very dirty. And what the league did was, of course, they can't stop people from importing them, but they said, if you don't bring it within the FCC specs, we won't allow you to advertise it in QST anymore. And so they went back, they did some design modifications, and now they brought them back, and they were just barely within the limit. Okay, so they complied. The other interesting thing, I spoke with a ham who was active, in fact, in HSDCS down in Orange County, and he was going through a hospital, and he had a Baofeng radio, and he had, I think, a Kenwood or Yaesu tuned to the same amateur frequency. And as he was walking through the hospital, the Baofeng was reacting all over the place to the all the different equipment that they were walking past, whereas the Japanese radio stayed perfectly quiet until somebody called. So the fact that something is dirty on the sending side also means it's susceptible to out of band signals on the receive side. It's you know, there's some reciprocity there. So some people may say, well, I don't care if I transmit outside the band. Yeah, but you're also going to be listening to a lot of junk, and it's going to degrade the performance of your receiver.
Yeah.
Okay, Mike, N6 UGA has got his hand up.
Yeah, the reason I raised the question about the certified one service is that before I retired, I worked in an industry where the industrial plants had their own fire departments. And those fire departments were often also certified as stations in the local city department for mutual aid purposes. So their radios could operate on both the government system and the private plant system.
That's a really interesting use case. It'd be challenging to pick the equipment and as
Well, they use Motorola systems, and most of them were
Yeah.
P25. They
Yeah.
use Motorola
Yeah.
systems. So
very cool.
That's something I don't know the exact answer to that, but it's something I'm going to look for. I can research that. And if that is something that was done within the limits of Title 47, or if they were maybe breaking the rules a little bit, but mutual aid communications between different services, because on one hand you've got public safety, and on the other one you have a private system. So I can see that.
Okay, Ed, you got something to add to this? Your hand is up. KG6 ZML, please unmute and on the board. Oh. Dan, you take it, and we'll come back to Ed.
Okay, so like for the last 20, well, most of the last 20 years, DMR, P25, I think the signaling isn't an issue because it's all software, all the digital modes. And whether it's encoded or not is up to the agency's policies. If and unless you're stuck with Motorola, how it's encrypted becomes an agency's specific preference. And I might have been lucky, but in the agency I work for, they just assume that you use your amateur gear and then spend the money buying that is only needed for administrative work. And we had to get permission, of course, and it was checked annually for, spectral purity. And I think it's pretty much nationwide for the agency I work for. And I have reason to believe it's similar in other agencies. So, and the problem, for instance, nobody mentioned the anytone. And I think the first 868 came out in 2015, if I think. And so the obstacle to using it was writing code plugs. And in doing that, you had to make the decision to disable encryption if you're using it on the amateur frequencies. And they were Part 90 approved and not Part 97 approved. And they're selling like hotcakes and have been ever since. And I think the issue with the Bofang, I know the issue with the Bofang was they did get a Part 90 type acceptance on one of the very early versions of the UV5R, but they started changing the firmware rapid fire, and they weren't resubmitting the firmware and the hardware for recertification for a Part 90 acceptance. And so the question of, can you use, it seems like it's commonplace for amateurs to use Part 90 radios, and it's up to us to make sure that we're using them properly. Sure. and not blowing into other other radio uses. I mean, if we start interfering with land mobile radios, we'd never find a mountaintop again in the future.
Right. That's right.
I think that may be a regulation that's unique to amateur radio that talks about operating our equipment within the regulations in terms of things like spurious emissions and all that. It's incumbent upon us, not the manufacturer. It's incumbent upon us to make sure that our equipment is operating properly. And I don't know that applies to any other service, actually.
Yeah, and over what is it now? 8 years, 9 years, they've been selling Anytones in the U.S. They made it more and more challenging to program them the wrong way.
Yeah,
but still,
that's all part of their certification. How hard is it, or how easy is it to modify something? Really, to fall within a certain part. One of the things that they look at is how easy or how difficult is it to modify the radio. Cutting a diode is way too easy.
But passing around 2 or 3 hex values to enter in the right place is even easier.
Well, like the example I gave is this amplifier. For me to enter the code in this amplifier, I have no clue what it is. I don't know what the algorithm is to generate the code from the serial number. If I knew that, I could do it, but it's not published. Therefore,
and just in the case of DMR, if you want, how do I say don't get me started on encryption in part 97.
Okay.
If you wanted privacy in your communications in DMR in simplex, if you do the math, you have 2 time slots and 15 color codes and a frequency. So, you pick one of each at random and say, set it to this and that. And then it'd be, how do I say it? The odds of someone understanding what you're saying. Well, first of all, a good DMR radio won't pick up anything that's not set to the same color code and time slot, which is the beauty of digital radio. And you wouldn't be interfering with anybody else either, but you'd have a pretty private conversation.
Right. I think you've described an important distinction. There's a big difference between privacy and secrecy.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, Harry, you've been waiting for a long time. Harry, you got your hand up. You want to take it away?
Yes, I'd like to find out if there's somebody we can consult with when we're doing public service, amateur radio, and crossing the various services with emergency stuff with our search and rescue groups. I'd like to have an advisor or a help in figuring out what radios are still legal of the ones I've inherited.
Good to see you, Harry, by the way. Welcome. Nice
Hi,
to see you
Dennis.
tonight. Yeah. That's a good question.
I have a to-go box that I think broke every rule in this book that I just showed at the Oxcom show.
Uh-oh. The one thing that always stands out and one of the rules that I think covers some of what you're talking about is immediate threat to life and property. And when you have immediate threat to life and property, that's one where the rules are kind of out the window and you do what you got to do to make that happen. And so in the case of, if you're doing a search and rescue, I'm not sure how well that applies to that, but if you're in the immediate, if someone's life is in immediate danger, you can use any radio in any service that you want. And it's not like you have to ask permission to do that. There's just many examples of that happening in recent history. So Marty's got his hand up. He may have a better answer for that, and maybe know the expert that you could consult for that particular thing.
I don't know about the expert, but I discussed this with a retired FCC engineer in charge from the Bay Area. Yeah, Phil Kane, K2ASP. And he said, there's a difference between using whatever you have for safety of life and property and planning to use things that you're not licensed for.
Yeah.
And so, the fact that you have the thing sitting there ready to go, it means you have the full intention when the time came of using something that you're not licensed for. And he said, basically, he's never seen a situation that passed that life and property smell test. It was always people, and I've heard the same thing from like CERT groups and others where they say, well, we're buying a bunch of ham radios, and when it's an emergency, we can just go ahead and use them. The rules are out the window. No, they're not. Because among other things, you could be interfering with legally licensed individuals who are actually trying to do something and not realize it. Don't take that exception. Don't interpret it too broadly.
Don't make the exception the rule rather than the other way around.
Yeah, it's absolutely.
Good points here. Ed's got his hand back up. You going to try it again? Unmute and come aboard. Ed? KJ.
Spacebar or Alt A.
I'm here.
There you are.
Getting back with you on that. I know I'm Coast Guard Auxiliary, and I use ICOM commercial VHF radios by setting various banks for various services in the programming mode. Like our auxiliary frequencies, auxiliary own our commercial radio and their narrow band FM. So that's bank number one. Bank number two is marine frequencies. And when I program them in, it's wide FM, but I have to limit my power, max power to 25 watts to comply with marine frequencies. And then another bank, I will have ham, because I am also a licensed ham. Just by changing the banks, I meet the parameters for each group, and nobody's given me grief in doing my triennial inspections of my radios by Coast Guard Auxiliary.
Ed, are the auxiliary frequencies licensed under the same section as the marine frequencies?
Should be all under part.
They're under Part 90, if I'm not mistaken.
It should be under Part 80, maritime service.
Right, but ours are land mobile frequencies that we have. If you hunt them down, they exist, but they're not for general publication. They're in the ballpark 150 megahertz, I will tell you that.
Well, Larry's got his hand up. You got an answer for us there, Larry?
It's not necessarily an answer. Years ago, when I was talking to a NASA spectrum management guy, a lot of the Coast Guard Auxiliary, Civil Air Patrol, and stuff like that are really grandfathered in on because they go back quite a ways. Because I was having some comments made. I was talking to him about the Civil Air Patrol at the time and the frequencies and the equipment they use. And he says a lot of especially federal services get grandfathered in because they've been doing it for such a long time. And it's kind of an uber gray area. And as long as the quote unquote nothing gets abused, they don't do a whole lot about it.
Okay. Any comments on that? No comments. Barry, how we doing it?
This is why when I program my radios, I do it in compliance with the Auxiliary Communications Manual.
Right.
And the thing is, I do the same thing if I'm programming another member's Baofeng for them. They get the same sort of loadout that I have, and I tell them, if you're not a ham, I'm not putting ham frequencies in for you right now. When you get your technician class license, you get those.
Hey, you know who might be a good authority on this is Gordon West, WB6NOA.
No, you know, Marty, I was thinking of somebody else here in Southern California who'd probably be even a better expert is Bill Schultz, who is the radio officer for Coast Guard Auxiliary here in LA.
Okay.
Yeah, it just
Good.
occurred to me. So Bill might be a good guy to contact to find
Yeah, I know
out.
Gordo's a member of the Coast Guard Auxiliary and very active, but Bill
Bill's
may
the
have-
radio officer.
he's
yeah.
the official guy. Sounds
Yeah,
a great
he's the official
source.
guy. He's a good resource. So Bill Schultz, if anybody's interested, I can't think of his call sign, but he works at HRO in Anaheim. So, and I think he hasn't retired yet. He's still there. So, as far as I know, so he would be a good person to contact to find out, maybe have some insight in that. So I would have thought that the auxiliary would have also operated under that same Part 80 under maritime, but I could be wrong about that.
Okay, Barry, how we doing in chat?
We're good.
Okay, nobody's got any more hands up. We've pretty well been open for jumping in for comments, but I open it up anyway for comments.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, the comment in the chat there that with the exception of cellular frequencies, there are no prohibitions on listening to anything. So any radio, and as Michelle pointed out earlier, that the big exception to that is cellular, mobile, or the mobile telephones, cellular telephones. And that goes back to the analog days, that the prohibitions of monitoring cellular, when they were, before they became totally digital, they were, we were all analog systems, which were much easier to monitor than the modern systems. But of course, I think modern systems could probably easily be monitored with the right software, with an SDR, one of those little SDR dongles, because it covers the frequency range. They're not blocked, which is interesting. But anyway.
Okay,
Yep.
we start to wrap this up.
Yeah.
73s.
Thanks a lot.
7-3, everybody.
Good night, all.
Till next time. Bye-bye, Harry. Good to see you.
Thanks, Dennis. Same here. Have a nice
Yeah.
day.
Okay. Stay safe too.